Hi class, welcome to our first chapter, Food and Culture, Chapter 1. I wanted to do some disclaimers about this book before we get started. First of all, I think this is one of the better books out there. However, it is not perfect by any means, and I do not love all parts of this book. I would take out the chapter on communication if it was up to me, but I can't. And I also feel that this book has a lot of stereotypes. Whether true or not, I don't think it was necessary for this book to include some of the stereotypes that the book does. And so I want you to know that when I'm talking, I am talking from the book. I'm not talking about my opinions. This is stuff that is published in your book, and I hope that nobody is offended, but I do acknowledge that this book is pretty stereotypical. So I apologize for that. I wish this book talked a little bit more about food and culture versus communication and healthcare. I think this book is written for healthcare practitioners, and so I'll try to focus more on the food and culture part, but as you're reading, you might notice kind of a bit of information geared towards maybe nurses or doctors or social workers who might be interviewing somebody about their diet or health belief practices. So we'll get started. I'm not going to read everything from my slides because you have a lot of it on your own PowerPoints, but I'm going to highlight some key parts, especially that I want you to know. Where I have written in red, for example, well, sorry, I thought this was red here. But some of these statistics have updated census information from the 7th edition textbook. So if you are using the 6th edition textbook, for example, this 40%, 13%, 11%, 75, etc., may be slightly different. That being said, I think during this entire semester, I might ask you like one question about census numbers. So I'm not going to ask you these specific numbers. It's just to get kind of an overview. You know, you can look at this and see 40% are white. So whether it's 40% or it was 38% in the 6th edition, it really doesn't matter that much. Okay, so with that being said, we will get started. So the census. The census is how we gather information about people who live in the United States. And in the United States, about 40% are not white. So again, here's the book with some very broad stereotypes. 13% are foreign born. 11% have one parent who was foreign born. And there are 75 different ancestry groups. The census does not account for everybody. It's estimated that 11 million people are unaccounted for, and people who are unaccounted for maybe didn't answer census questionnaires because they didn't speak English, weren't able to read, etc. Some census questionnaires are published in multiple languages. However, it's possible that somebody's language was overlooked or due to writing or reading issues, they weren't able to respond or they chose not to respond. In the United States, Latin Americans and Asians are the largest growing demographic groups. So what is food? From a nutrition point of view, food is something that provides nutrients necessary to maintain life and grow. But to me, food is much more than that. So what is food to you? I want you guys to think about it, and during some of the discussions in this class, you're going to be answering that. To me, food is tasty, it's fun, it's a celebration, it's loving, it can elicit emotions, it's enjoyable, it's something I look forward to, but it also gives me strength and makes me feel healthy, especially certain foods. You know, if I want to maybe work out, have a really good workout, I'm going to eat certain foods, or if I'm preparing for a race, I'm going to eat certain foods, or to stay well hydrated, I'm going to drink certain things. So I think food is a lot, and food can be family, it could be religion, so many different things. How is eating different than feeding? Well, animals feed, horses, cows, pigs, etc., and humans eat. Humans, when we eat, there's more enjoyment, there's more formality. We're not just stuffing our faces with the sole purpose of nourishing our bodies. The omnivore's paradox. So humans are omnivores, and what that means is we can eat a wide variety of foods, including fruits, vegetables, grains, meats, seafood, just about anything for our environment. And this makes us very adaptable as well as flexible. However, because of this, there's not one food that provides us all of the nutrition that we need. So we can't just, like a cow, eat grass all day long. That wouldn't do it for us. So we have to have a big variety, and we need lots of different foods all the time. This is kind of a blessing and a curse because we like new foods, we like to experiment, yet we're a little bit cautious. And often we tend to stick with what's familiar. Just think about your favorite restaurant and what you order every time you go there. I bet of the menu, say maybe there's 30 items on the menu, you might just order 1 or 2 items every single time. And that's because you're familiar with them and you like them and you're sure you're going to like them. So we like to try new foods, but we're still a little bit skeptical. Food can identify us. So are there groups of people who eat different foods? Maybe there's people who are foodies or vegans or people who are weightlifters or bodybuilders or people who, like to eat local or eat organic or eat sustainably. I do believe there's different groups. There's even different religious groups. Some people believe there's foods that can help make them stronger, weaker, sicker, or healthier. Spinach will make you stronger. Vitamin C will make you stronger. Maybe unhealthy foods are going to make you weaker or sicker, etc. Sometimes when we're eating with groups of peers, we can be easily influenced by them, and we may try foods that we wouldn't usually try. This is especially true for children. Children are very influenced by those around them. So this could be siblings, teachers, classmates, etc. And they even are influenced by media and fictional characters on TV. So their self-identity with food often has to do with who's around them. Eating out can set the mood for food identity. If you're eating at a sports bar downtown, there's probably going to be burgers and French fries and maybe wings, and people might be watching TV. They might be watching some sports games and being loud and drinking beer. Or perhaps you're eating at a quiet Italian restaurant and there's wine and there's Caesar salad and there's some pasta, and you might be dressed a little bit nicer and you might have a white napkin at your table. So different restaurants and where you eat can change the mood of food as well. Symbolic uses of food. There are many different foods throughout history that have been used symbolically, and bread is a very good example. So what can bread represent? Bread can represent the staff of life, the body of Christ. There are many expressions for bread. I have a lot of bread, or I have a lot of dough. He's got a lot of dough. People are breadwinners. He or she is a breadwinner. So bread can be used to describe money. And bread has been used in different traditions and ceremonies really throughout history. Cultural identity. What we eat defines who we are and who we are not. So this is a link as well as some pictures from one of my favorite cultural books called Hungry Planet. And this is written by Peter Mendel. And on your canvas, there's also a link to a TED Talk he did. At the very least, go to this website and look at these pictures. He has taken pictures of families from all over the world, as well as what they eat in 1 week and how much they spend on it. And it is just so interesting to look at what foods people are eating around the world. And some cultures have just so much food. And some cultures really have so little food, or food made up of all foods, just fruits, just vegetables, just spices, just meats, just grains, versus bottles of soda or cookies or crackers or pizzas. So if nothing more, browse through these pictures. They're truly fascinating, and really just, might kind of open your eyes to the availability of food in the United States compared to other places. All right. So our food identity often starts with childhood. And often this can be due to special occasions. So it might be birthday. Maybe your mom made a special cake at your birthday. It might be holidays, maybe Christmas. You had tamales or you had turkey or roast beef. Hanukkah. My family celebrated Christmas and Hanukkah, so we would have potato pancakes every year. And that's something that I fondly look forward and remember. Food can start kind of young. Comfort foods, these might be things like snacks or chips or ice cream, foods that, perhaps your mother or your wife or your husband made for you, maybe macaroni and cheese, pizza, something that's just going to kind of make you feel good because yes, people do eat based on emotions. Our book has some pretty stereotypical names associated with foods and cultures. Some of the examples that they give that I do not necessarily support or agree with, but this is from your book. Germans, krauts, Chinese dim sums, Mexicans beaners, Irish potato heads, and Southern white folks as crackers. And so I actually think that those stereotypes are quite awful, but those are stereotypes that have been used throughout history to link foods with different cultures. What about etiquette? I definitely want you to know what etiquette is. So etiquette is the appropriate use of food and the behaviors associated with eating. And etiquette can change depending on the setting. So I already talked about the sports bar versus the nice Italian restaurant. The etiquette in the sports bar is going to be totally different. You can eat your fries and your burger with your hands. You probably don't have a white linen napkin across your lap. But the etiquette at the Italian restaurant is going to be opposite. You're going to be cutting your food with a knife and fork. You're going to be eating slowly. You're not going to be screaming or yelling at any TV screens. It's just going to be very different. So etiquette can change based on situations. Food can also be used to define status. So what types of foods are eaten and who can eat with whom. For example, if I said lobster, filet mignon, Dom Perignon, caviar, you might think of perhaps a wealthy person or an affluent person eating those foods. If I said ramen soup, cup of noodles, hot dogs, Cheetos, something like that, maybe you're going to think of somebody who's not as affluent or a college student. I know I ate some of that in college. And then whom can eat with whom? In the United States, there are some rules regarding this between cultures, but in other countries, these are more pronounced. For example, in India with the caste system. But there are many countries where, women and children eat together and men eat together, for example. What is culture? So what do you think culture is? A broad definition of culture is the values, beliefs, attitudes, practices that are accepted by members of a group or community. Where do we get culture? Do we buy it at Walmart or Target or Costco? No. Culture is learned. Culture is passed down from generation to generation, and your culture can change. So it's dynamic. Your culture when you were a child might be very different from your culture when you're a college student, depending on the friends you surround yourself with or how close your family ties are, or perhaps even what city you live in. So culture is something that's constantly changing and evolving. It can be defined by ethnicity, and ethnicity is associated with shared behavior patterns, food habits, dress, language, etc. There can be diversity between ethnic groups. So just because people are of the same ethnic group, it doesn't necessarily mean that they all have the exact same culture. For example, there may be people of the same ethnic group who have moved to another country and kind of adopted that culture versus their own. So culture can change. Acculturation is the process of adapting or transitioning from your primary or original culture to a new culture. And this often happens when people migrate and or marry into another cultural group. And so it can change beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. There are differences between first generation immigrants, second and third generation immigrants. So a first generation immigrant is somebody who was born in another country and then moved here. A second generation immigrant was born here, but their parents were born in another country. And a third generation immigrant was born here, their parents were born here, and their grandparents were born in another country. Often, first generation immigrants hold on to their cultural ties tighter and have somewhat more difficult of a time acculturating. As people become second or third or fourth or even fifth generation immigrants, most of those generations adopt the new cultures, beliefs and attitudes and practices, and are more like their new culture than their older culture or their original culture. There's an example of Asian Indians, for example. Many first generation immigrants will let their children learn English and go to English schools. However, they still want their children to marry an Asian Indian person. So they're still holding on to some of their traditional beliefs and practices. Assimilation happens when people from one cultural group shed their ethnic identity and fully emerge into the majority culture. And assimilation doesn't necessarily happen overnight. It can be a gradual process. Acculturation of food habits. So when people transition from one cultural group to another, such as with an immigration or move or marrying into a different culture than your own, often food habits are the last things to change. So they're the last things to change. And sometimes this is because food can be eaten in privacy at your own home, away from other cultures observing you. So you may need to change the language you speak. You may need to, learn a new language like English or Spanish or French to adapt to another culture. You may need to change the way you dress to fit in another culture, because people are going to see how you dress and people are going to see and hear how you speak or how you read or communicate. But people won't necessarily see how you eat, because a lot of times food is eaten at home. Sometimes people do have to adjust to new cultures' foods immediately, and this could be due to ingredients not being available in the new location that they have moved to. Which foods are accepted first? So people easily adapt to changes with sweets, fast foods, and meats. These are things that people like. Categorization of foods. In the United States, we have food groups, and we can categorize them by nutrients or similar food types. So for example, we might have fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, dairy, protein foods, etc. Other countries have additional categories of food. They may have prestigious foods, sympathetic foods, physiologic foods, or superfoods. And we're going to learn about those more as we go along in this book. Core and complementary food model. So I definitely want you to know the difference between these. So core foods. Core foods are foods that are eaten every day, and they could be different from one culture to another, but they're foods that are likely to be eaten every day. So for example, maybe it's tortillas or rice or bread or corn or wheat or plantains or taro or cassava or yams, things that are eaten, things that are usually starchy foods and staple foods. They're eaten every day. Secondary foods might be eaten once or twice a week, but they're not necessarily eaten every day. So maybe that's apples or lettuce or strawberries, something like that. Peripheral foods are eaten sporadically and usually represent personal likes or preferences, but don't necessarily represent the culture as a whole. So maybe once in a while I like to go have some brie cheese, but I don't do that all the time. That would be a peripheral food for me. When people change the foods that they eat as they change from one culture to another, or say they've moved or immigrated, usually the peripheral foods change first, and they hang on to those secondary and core foods longer. So I definitely want you to know examples of core food, secondary, peripheral, as well as what would change. Flavors. So flavoring is very important, and flavors of foods can actually help you recognize where they're come from. I know when you walk into an Italian restaurant, maybe you smell garlic and olive oil, and maybe you can smell some tomatoes cooking. When you walk into an Indian restaurant, maybe you smell some curries. When you walk into a Mexican restaurant, maybe you smell some cilantro or salsa or kind of some spices. And so these help identify different foods from different cultures. Originally, it's thought that spices and seasonings may have been used to help preserve foods or potentially even mask the taste of spoiled foods. For example, a lot of salt on meat or a lot of pepper on meat. Many spices have antimicrobial properties. They may even have anti-inflammatory properties such as capsaicin and cumin. Those are some very, very good healthy spices. Garlic as well. What are meals? So meals can be defined very differently depending on who you ask. Some cultures define meals related to a course or a side dish, or perhaps it's a specific ingredient. So in the US, we often say, well, this is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Other cultures might say, well, it's not a meal unless it has rice, or it's not a meal unless it has plantains. My mother, she is European. For her, it's not a meal unless there's bread present. So people have different definitions of how they define meals. Service order also varies by country. So for example, in the US, we might expect appetizers or salads or bread to come out first, and then our entree, and then dessert. In other countries, salads come after the entree, and in some countries, all the food comes at once. In the US, we also expect that everybody seated at the table is served at once. But many other countries, as the food is cooked, they bring it out to whoever's that food is. And so it's possible that one person is eating their food and all the others are waiting. In the US and other countries as well, you might group foods by the meal, but not every country does this. But for example, breakfast foods, sausage, bacon, eggs, hash brown. Lunch foods, maybe sandwiches, hot dogs, hamburger. Dinner foods, maybe it's going to be a larger course with a meat and a starch and a vegetable. Who prepares the food? So this might be important for some cultural or ethnic or religious groups. So for example, it's very important who prepares the food for Orthodox Jews. Who eats the food may be important. Friends, acquaintances, different statuses within your ethnicity or ethnic group. Portion size. Portion sizes widely vary from country to country. In the United States, we have pretty big portion sizes. In Argentina and Brazil, they have pretty big portion sizes. In France and Spain, they have pretty little portion sizes. And so what is expected of the portion, and then what are you expected to do with that portion? Are you expected to eat it all? Or are you expected to leave some? In some countries, leaving a little food signifies that the host prepared enough food to satiate you and you had plenty to eat. In other countries, eating everything indicates to the host that you thoroughly enjoyed it, and asking for seconds might be more appropriate. Food culture. So globalization has really changed how we eat. And globalization really means that all parts of the world, or many parts of the world, are able to access food and ingredients from other countries. So for example, you can go to Starbucks all over the world. You can go to Pizza Hut all over the world. You can go to McDonald's all over the world. I was in Mexico over my holiday break, and in one town that I was in Mexico, just one town, there were 8 Starbucks in that one town in Mexico. So it's really kind of crazy. It used to be important to eat seasonally prepared and harvested foods. And that's because they were at their peak of ripeness. They were fresh. If you didn't eat them, then they would spoil. Now, because of shipping and, processing and refrigeration and treatment, we can eat almost whatever we want whenever we want it. We can get raspberries from another country, or mangoes or papayas from another country, or pineapples or coconuts, all year long, watermelons all year long, when we used to just be able to eat seasonally. So that has also changed the way that we eat foods and what we eat. Individual food habits. So this again refers to the US. And in the US, in general, the number one reason for choosing food is taste. Number two is cost, then convenience, self-expression, and well-being and variety. In some circumstances, cost may come before taste, but in general situations in the United States of America, taste is the number one reason for food choice. Edible or inedible rules. So these are different rules to categorize foods, and these may apply to cultures or individuals. Inedible foods would be foods that you would not eat, and perhaps you wouldn't eat them because they're poisonous. Perhaps there's a very strong belief or taboo, such as cattle in India. Perhaps it's something like an animal that has died, roadkill. You wouldn't eat that. Perhaps you're pregnant and there's certain foods that are inedible when you're pregnant. You just don't do that. Edible by animals, but not me. These are things that animals would eat, but you don't eat. So maybe rodents or feed grains. And this can vary extremely widely by culture. Edible by humans, but not my kind. So this is foods that are recognized as acceptable in some societies, but not necessarily your own society. So maybe this is snails or horse meat or bear or dog meat or crickets or whale or, chicken feet. Edible by humans, but not by me. This is foods that are accepted by your cultural group, but not necessarily you. So maybe tripe or liver or kosher foods or menudo. And then edible by me are foods that you accept. This is chicken legs, obviously, and here this is sea urchin. The actual sea urchin, you break it open and you take out the sea urchin. It's eaten raw on sushi. Consumer food choice model. The consumer food choice model is multiple different factors that contribute to which foods or beverages somebody will choose. And so I do want you to be familiar with the factors that go into the consumer food choice model. So those would be all of these factors here. And you can read a little bit more about them in your book. Okay, hopefully remember, what is the primary motivation for choosing foods? In the United States, it is taste. Is there a preference for sugar and fats? What do you think? Do they taste good? Yes, of course there is. There's a preference for sugar and fats, and it actually starts as early as infancy. It is universal across all cultures. How about bitterness? So bitterness, our preference for bitterness changes with age. Children who are young don't generally tend to like bitter foods, but people who are older tend to like bitter foods, and it's possible that they actually don't detect the bitterness that much, and that's why they enjoy those foods more. Second most important thing, according to the consumer food choice model, is cost. And remember, I said it generally is taste. However, in some circumstances, it can be cost. And so this would depend on, income level, etc. There are many people living in poverty or near poverty, and currently, as of 2014 census, 14 million households are food insecure. That means they don't have adequate access to safe food, appropriate food, adequate food for health, acceptable food. So there are many, many people who are not getting access to food. And for any of these people, cost would actually be their number one versus taste. And this happens all over the world as well as in the United States. What about access? So where do you get your food? Do you go to restaurants? Do you go to grocery stores? Where are they? Are they close? Are they far? Can you drive there? Do you have to walk? Do you have to take the bus? This is going to influence your food choice as well. There are places we're going to talk about called food deserts, and this is where people live very far away from grocery stores, and their only food is convenience stores, chips and sodas and candies. And so that can play a big role as well. For students, I know there's limited dining on campus, no matter which campus you're at, and campus is not close to a grocery store. So if you're on campus, you either have to eat what they have or you have to have prepared a lunch ahead of time. What about working? If people work, they are more likely to eat out and not cook. Specifically, if a woman works, she is less likely to cook because generally in the past, women held a lot of the responsibility for cooking. This is maybe not currently true. I think roles are shifting a lot, but in the past, women were responsible for doing a lot of the cooking and household work. And as women went back to work and started holding their own jobs, the hours spent cooking have decreased significantly. As far as eating out goes, our eating out has actually declined slightly, and I think this was due to the economic crisis. Instead of eating out, more people are cooking at home, and they're not necessarily cooking from scratch, but they're doing easy-to-prepare meals or maybe what you would call half-scratch. So maybe they're buying a bag of frozen veggies and cutting up some chicken and putting it in. Or maybe they're getting a bag of frozen veggies and mixing it with some rice, or a bag of salad and mixing that with something. Maybe they have some frozen hamburger buns and they're going to eat those with hamburger, of course. So we are cooking at home, but we're not doing scratch cooking. Additional reasons for food choice. So religion, this is huge. Seventh-day Adventists, mostly vegetarians, don't drink coffee, don't drink alcohol, don't drink caffeine, don't drink hot drinks, don't smoke. Jewish beliefs about food combinations, milk and meat need to be separate. And there's a lot of additional rules that we'll hear about coming forward. Regional choices. So where you live might influence what you eat. What's popular in your region. Maybe it's spicy food. Maybe it's bland food. Advertising, food porn. What did you see on the Food Network or the magazine or the cookbook? What commercials are trying to influence you to buy this or buy that. And then your physical and spiritual well-being, what you eat and how it can make you feel. This is a cool picture of the United States and just some foods that are well known in different states across the country. And actually, our very last chapter in the book talks about diversity of food within the United States. And the United States actually has a very big range of food that's known to each region. So this will be fun to talk about when we get there. Additional factors affecting consumer food choice, so age. I talked about older people versus younger people. Adolescents, in addition, they're very susceptible to advertising and peer pressure. If their friends are saying, oh, don't eat that, that's gross. Oh, your mom sent you cottage cheese, that's gross. Or, oh, eat this smoothie, it's really good for you. Or don't buy that, or I dare you to try this. They're going to be influenced by it. Adolescents also may or may not have money to spend on food, so that could be a factor as well. Gender. So there may be different food rules depending on gender. Some countries, some religious groups do have foods that are restricted for women to eat, and possibly women in general, or specifically maybe women when they're pregnant. There are foods that have gender associations, whether these are true or false or good or bad. These are according to your book. But I think beer, steak, kind of masculine foods, rosé wine, salads, perhaps more feminine foods. And these are according to your book, not necessarily my personal opinion. Wealth and education. People with more money and more education generally tend to eat a wider variety of foods because they have more money to spend on foods. Doesn't necessarily mean they're healthier, but they have more power to buy at the grocery store. Reading labels. So 6 out of 10 people do read labels, but only about 50% of those people actually act on the label. And as we know, because of our current obesity epidemic, whether they read the labels or act on the labels It doesn't seem to be helping at all. So there's a lot of work we need to do. There's actually a new nutrition facts label coming out. It doesn't have to be out this year, but a lot of companies will start adopting it 2018. So that new nutrition fact label should give clearer, better information for consumers. Cultural competency. So cultural competency is being aware and knowledgeable about other cultures, being able to accept other cultures, realizing people are different than yourself. And so this is very important. If we're culturally competent, we can learn about cultures in an open-minded fashion. In the US, we are truly a melting pot. There is not dominant cultures. We have so many different ethnic cultures here. And so that is actually a contrast to healthcare providers. And so this is when I'm talking about, I don't like how the book talks a lot about healthcare providers, but it does. So what I'm talking about here is the United States is a melting pot. There are people from all different religions, ethnic backgrounds, countries, languages, education, etc. When you look at healthcare providers, so doctors, nurses, physical therapists, etc., the majority of them are white and Caucasian. And so healthcare providers and the healthcare that's being given doesn't necessarily match the people that it's being given to. And so for a healthcare provider, it's especially important that they have cultural competence so that they can understand different beliefs of cultures they're treating. Okay, Segway. Each chapter in our book has these little side sections that don't necessarily have to do with the chapter, but they're still really interesting, and they're called segues. So this one is called, Does Hunger Cause Obesity? And so this is something really just kind of maybe surprising. You would think if somebody didn't have money, had not enough money, was poor, didn't have money to buy food, they would be skinny. We see the opposite. So people who are living in poverty have the highest rates of overweight and obesity. One of the reasons for this is that food that is not so good for us is very, very cheap. And so people can buy, things from the dollar menu or the dollar store or the ramen for 10 cents that I'm talking about. And when people don't have a lot of money, they need to make that money last and translate into calories to nourish them. So they may choose to spend that $2 getting 2 hamburgers instead of $2 to buy an apple, let alone an organic apple. So this is quite a paradox. Intercultural foods, I think I'm going to skip this page, but this has to do with healthcare providers talking to people about which foods that they eat. One of the key is to not stereotype. I guess I will highlight this a little bit because this is something I specifically try to avoid as a dietitian. I work with people of many different cultures, and I do ask them about their diets. And so if you ask them, what did you eat for lunch? What did you eat for breakfast? What did you eat for dinner? You're putting their food into these categories, and you're making assumptions that they have meals that they call breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that food is going to fit into those meals somehow. And so you're already stereotyping that person. Many people don't eat 3 square meals a day. Many people might eat 1 meal a day. Many people eat 5 meals a day. And many people just snack. They kind of graze. And so what I like to ask when I'm working with a client is, tell me what the first thing you ate was when you wake up. Okay, you had some cereal. Well, how much did you have? Okay, like a cup. Did you put anything in it? Milk. Okay, was it fat-free, non-fat, cow's milk, soy milk? Okay, and then what was the next thing you ate? And what was the next thing? And what was the last thing you ate? And do it more of a timeline, because then they can clearly tell you what they ate without having to categorize their foods. This also creates a really open relationship and a more trusting relationship, because they can tell you what they ate without having to think, oh gosh, they're going to judge me for what I did or didn't eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There is a slide I took out from your notes. It's called Classifying Food Habits According to Nutritional Impact, so you can just ignore that. I decided that that was not pertinent for this class. And then the American paradox. This actually is similar to the omnivore's paradox, but specifically to America. In the United States, there are so many different cultural restaurants. Even in our small county of San Luis Obispo, we have so many great cultural restaurants. And we want to try them. We're curious about them, but we're still cautious. And I think the perfect example is sushi. I remember when I first heard that sushi even existed, I was like, raw fish? That is disgusting. Why would anybody eat raw fish? Like, even cooked fish smells. This is the grossest thing I've ever thought of. And then when I was a little older in high school, I started dating a guy and he was like, oh, sushi's the best. I love sushi so much. And I was like, oh gosh, I don't want to eat sushi. It's raw. But because I was with him and I was influenced by him, he was somebody I trust, I tried sushi and I ended up really liking it. And now, it's one of my favorite things to eat. So it's just an example of how we can be cautious and suspicious at first. But there's a lot of variety out there. And so sometimes being around our peers and having them, maybe give us a little nudge to try something new could be a good thing. If you try it and you don't like it, you never have to eat it again either. Okay. So the American paradox is our desire and want to try new foods, but it's also this cautiousness. So the sushi, for example, I have never traveled to Japan, but from what I hear, the sushi in Japan is very different than the sushi in America. And our sushi here is very Americanized. We have all these fancy rolls and we use, what do we use? Jalapenos and cream cheese and spicy mayo. And those aren't necessarily things that would traditionally be found in Japan. So a lot of restaurants cater to our kind of cautiousness. For example, traditional Thai food, often the chicken in that would just be, some chicken with some bones on it. And they'd, take different cuts of the chicken and put it in the stew. And whoever was eating that would eat around the bone and it would be delicious. But a lot of people in the United States don't want to eat the bone and they don't want to have to pick around the bone and they think the bone might be less desirable. And so a lot of restaurants have kind of Americanized their recipes to instead put like boneless, skinless chicken breast in there or chicken thigh because we don't like the bone. So there are a lot of ethnic foods accessible to Americans, and some of them are original in their ethnicity and ingredients, and some of them have been very Americanized. And this will actually be one of our first discussion boards to talk about kind of what is authentic food. Actually, this comes around chapter 8, so you will have an opportunity to talk about this. All right. So in conclusion, I hope you enjoyed the first chapter. Remember, I did not cover absolutely everything from the chapter. I just kind of highlighted some key parts from the slides. I definitely want you to know. I would recommend using the slides in addition to your rating to take some of your own notes, as well as my lecture, and that should help you prepare for the quiz. All right, thank you. Bye.